Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna C. Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Today's topic is about religious freedom on campus. If you ask the average college student what his or her day was like, the student would probably tell you that he or she went to 2 or 3 classes, hung out with friends, and maybe attended an extracurricular meeting or athletic practice in the afternoon. With that said, some students know they want to go to a school where they will be immersed in their religious beliefs, while there are also many students who want to go to a school where religion doesn't take over their experience, but they can still put an effort towards their beliefs. Either way, the concept of religious freedom on campus has sparked much debate with regards to its place in higher education. Back with us today to provide his perspectives on the topic is Dr. Murali Balaji of the Hindu American Foundation. Murali, thanks for joining us.
Thanks again, Krishna.
So, first and foremost, I have to ask, so we understand where you stand on this. Does religion have a place in higher education, specifically the college experience?
Absolutely. I think to nuance that, I would say freedom of religion has a place in higher education and public discourse. In other words, you're free to believe, you're free not to believe. And I think that religion, the idea of religion, shouldn't be dogmatic or imposed upon within higher education frameworks, but that a student's right or a person's right to practice her or his own faith should be sacrosanct within the confines of a campus.
Got it. So I find myself somewhat conflicted. Religion, I have seen and observed, can serve as a unifying force to bring people together to believe in a way of thinking, a way of life. College experience is this melting pot of different beliefs and different perspectives that people have a chance to experience with each other. How do you marry the two concepts?
Well, let me share my own personal experience as someone who grew up very self-conscious about my Hindu identity, not necessarily wanting to share it. I went to the University of Minnesota, which was 1,300 miles away from my hometown of Philly. And it was there that my closest friends, all of whom were African American of different faiths, helped me feel more comfortable in my own religious tradition. One grew up Baptist, one grew up Jehovah's Witness, and our conversations about faith actually made me more comfortable in my own religious identity and more confident in it. I think these are the sort of conversations that people, whether they ascribe to a faith or not, can have in a college setting. And I think the diversity of faith perspectives is critical because we still have, and I do this work across the country, we still have a large segment of America's population that doesn't know, for example, what the difference between a Sunni and a Shia Muslim is, for example, or even the difference between a Muslim and a Hindu.
Right.
And I think that that sort of ignorance of religion can only be neutralized or diminished when students of different backgrounds interact with each other. And as I said, there shouldn't be a scale of religiosity. However, I think it's critical that students of diverse beliefs do have these conversations.
Okay. So, the typical college student is between the ages of 17 and 22, and I and many other guests have come on and said at that point in their life, their brains are like a bowl of mush. It's very moldable, it's very influenced. How does a college student, and you kind of alluded to this, stay true to their beliefs, but at the same time dip their toe, so to speak, into the waters of other religions and faiths? How do you ensure that it's okay to see what else is out there? Not so much because you want to change your religion or belief system, but because you want to be able to grow your perspective on how the world sees itself.
Yeah, and I think this is where college has a great foundation because there are obviously groups within college settings that will actively try to convert other students. I remember when I was at the University of Minnesota, they probably saw the brown guy who probably didn't fit their idea of who an ideal college student was. So, I would get proselytized, on a weekly basis. Yes, that happens, and I think that ultimately it's a student's decision whether they listen to those entreaties or not. But I think there's another aspect of free will. And I think students that come in wanting to know about their own faith identity can lean on other students of similar faith backgrounds. I think this is very critical in these times when, for example, Muslim American students really want to come together and say, hey, look, is there a space, a safe space for me to be able to have these discussions or share my concerns? But there are also interfaith settings, and this is maybe where you're talking about dipping the toe. There are definitely organizations, interfaith alliances at many college campuses across the country where the idea of dialogue and pluralism, you know, as a means of understanding each other's way of believing are really important in the day-to-day happenings of that campus. So, you know, I think this is multifold. There are obviously going to be students who are not comfortable in their own faith identity and maybe end up converting or maybe end up leaving the idea of organized religion altogether. There are people who actually strengthen their own religious identities, like I did, by learning about other religious groups. So I think it can work in multiple ways. Ultimately, it's up to the student and her or his own ability to introspect. That's going to play a big role.
So let's take the concept of understanding to a very relevant level that's happening in the real world today. Due to unfortunate nature of events that are happening by extremist groups like ISIS and previously Al-Qaeda, we have seen an increasing intolerance towards the Muslim community. How can the academic environment, specifically institutions of higher education, provide an environment that will allow for that intolerance to be eradicated, for students to be more informed of what's going on, and not just what they see at face value from the media or from whatever politicized individual they see or hear on the radio?
So there's 3 or 4 different aspects to this. First off, I think in this age of intolerance, xenophobia, Islamophobia, Muslim American students have that opportunity within the college settings to actually have these discussions internally. I think one of the things that we often overlook or underestimate is the ability of perhaps the millennial Muslim generation to be introspective and be self-critical. You know, because for years, one of the things that was happening is that, you know, the radicalization element, a lot of Muslim leaders would say, oh, this is not Islam, this is not Islam. But I think there is a growing acknowledgement that the extremists identify as Muslims, so there has to be an internal dialogue. And I think in college, there is a great perspective, you know, of Muslims of different ethnic backgrounds, different classes, and of different, you know, sectarian beliefs, whether they be Sunnis, whether they be Shiites, you know, to really say, all right, what does it mean for me to be an American? What does it mean for me to be a Muslim? And how can I fit myself into this greater landscape? In fairness, I think despite the backlash, American Muslims have been a lot better integrated into our American social fabric than their counterparts in Europe. And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with Islam's cultural diversity within the U.S., whereas in France, it is very limited to North African and Middle Eastern communities that have, by and large, not been accepted or integrated into French society, for example, or Belgian society. Arguably, there's a lot of self-segregation as well. But here, I think that the integration, overall integration of Muslim Americans into public discourse, in some ways has made the level of intolerance towards Muslims not as high as it could be. It's pretty bad now, but what I'm saying is it could be a lot worse. And then the 2 other quick things I would say is that academics have a responsibility to cultivate free exchange of ideas. And I think one thing that's critical here is that it's important for people who might hold Islamophobic views to allow their views to be challenged organically. You know, the only way you're going to stop hating your neighbor is to know him.
Right, right.
And I think, I truly believe that dialogue can go a long way. And colleges empower, or at least they provide the tools. It's up to the student to take that baton,
right.
To learn about others. I think the third thing in terms of what's happening right now, and the level of intolerance for Muslim Americans, is for Muslim American youth to connect with the struggles of other communities and vice versa. One of the great opportunities here, for example, is how Muslim American students might be able to see common cause with Jewish American students. How Islamophobia today mirrors anti-Semitism.
Right.
From, you know, not only today, but, you know,
1940s.
earlier parts of our century. One interesting thing in this debate about Syrian refugees, the same language about Syrians was being used to describe Jews post-World War II.
That's right.
And it's an embarrassing, you know, chapter of our history. So I do think that some of these walls need to be broken down within that millennial generation.
With that said, does the millennial Muslim generation have a responsibility to separate itself from the actions of these extremist groups? And what I mean by that is not just to say this is not representative of our faith, but to take more of a stand. I think to empathize, to acknowledge that this is not Islam, and to really make a clean break. Because so long as everyone keeps using the same verbiage, and I don't mean to say it's that simple, that using one word is what's causing confusion, but so long as there's some sort of common element, it'll be difficult for people to be able to separate one from the other.
So I'm going to say something very broad that allows for greater nuance once you break it down. I think every religious group has its scriptural and practical warts. In other words, there's no religion right now on earth that doesn't have issues, both in terms of its scriptural readings and interpretations, and the way it's practiced.
Right.
I think that instead of saying this is not Islam, Muslim American millennials can say, look, you know, they're probably reading the Quran in a way that it might have been read in the 7th century.
Right.
But we don't exist in the 7th century. We exist
Right.
in the 21st century. And I think understanding that societies have evolved, theological interpretations have grown and
Right.
evolved, I think can make for a much better case for a proactive understanding of Islam in the 21st century. And I think a much more culturally relevant understanding of Islam in the 21st century. So I would not encourage Muslim millennials to say this is not Islam. I think they have to acknowledge, just like I think followers of any faith tradition have to acknowledge the issues that have come up in the past with their own faith traditions. But they can take a proactive approach and say, look, we condemn terrorism, we condemn communal violence, and we condemn intolerance. But we can use our teachings to be a force for good. I mean, one of the conversations I've had with Muslim activists, you know, especially some counterparts in what I do within the Hindu American community, is how can you make issues such as LGBT rights, the environment, racism, sexism, relevant to theological understandings. And I think for Muslim millennials, they tend to reflect a more progressive generation, a generation that's much more accepting of LGBT equality, for example, of environmental justice. And so those are common themes that they can find friendship with other religious groups, humanists. So there are opportunities there.
Right. So let's take a complete 180 view from our argument so far. Where does atheism fit into this narrative?
Sure, and you know, it's funny because atheism and humanism often get conflated, and I think that,
And just for at least my edification, if not the audience, what is humanism?
well, so humanism, it's interesting because oftentimes humanism is considered a way of defining atheism. But humanism also acknowledges that people have a right to believe what they want to believe. But you know, humanism really is predicated on this idea that, you know, we are a human family, and that
Right.
the dogmas of religion should not necessarily divide us.
Understood.
Atheism, I think, just the denial that there's a divine power um, or God, that oversimplifies it. I think a lot of atheists want to just be respected for being who they are. I mean, I think atheists, humanists that I've spoken with really just believe that human beings can be good people without necessarily giving God credit for being good people. And I think that there's value to what they say. And I think atheists really find themselves marginalized in a country, ironically, where people are leaving organized religion.
This is true.
And yet, you know, religion is seen as a very important qualification to run for higher office.
Right.
So I think that it's kind of this interesting contradiction. More people are leaving organized religion, yet we still have these markers of religiosity within American society. Just the other day, I was saying the Pledge of Allegiance in a public hearing, and said one nation under God.
God, that's right.
So I think for a lot of atheists, that's still something where their own views or their own perspectives are not taken into consideration.
So let's take this to a more practical level. Imagine I am a rising junior, rising senior in high school. I'm about to enter college, getting ready for what will be a very unique time in my life, moving away from home, living on my own, and true independence of almost every facet of your life, including how you believe and how you think. What are some of the piece of advice you would give to an upcoming college student in terms of navigating their religious beliefs while they attend college, and of course also dipping the toe, so to speak, to expose themselves to other perspectives as well?
They give me advice that I wish I had gotten myself, and that is question. Question often. Talk to your parents, especially if you were raised within a specific tradition. Ask your parents why you are being raised in that faith.
May I interrupt you for a second? So I want to get back to this. Where does parenting fit into all of this?
Parenting plays a huge role in it. I think parenting, especially where religion is dogmatized or imposed, that can have an opposite effect. You know, a lot of young people who come from ultra-religious households tend to break from that when they go to college, because they see what their parents are doing as an imposition of values. And you know, a lot of people say, oh, it's rebellion. No, I think it's more just exercise in what they see as agency from what they saw as very dogmatic parenting. So parenting plays a huge role. I think parents who have conversations with their kids about religion, you know, whether they believe or not believe, can actually make their children much more prepared to deal with a lot of these negotiations in college. I'm very impressed, you know, among Hindu Americans, you know, my constituency, when I work with young Hindu parents, my age group in 30s and 40s, they have done a really good job of surrounding their children with resources that we didn't have growing up. And that means, you know, children's books that happen to have stories about Hindu deities, for example, or taking them to classes that teach them cultural values. Those are resources I didn't have, let's say, or even my friends didn't have in the 70s and the 80s. And that's really important, because what that does is that at a very young age instills in your child that they can be contributing to the secular sphere and also confident and empowered and, most importantly, knowledgeable about their own religious identity. And I think more parents are having good conversations, constructive conversations about faith with their children.
So going back to the advice that you'd be giving, you were mentioning talking to your kids before they enter college.
Talking to your kids, or for the kids, talking to your parents.
Yeah, right.
Before you enter college.
Right.
And try to read as much as you can.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And that's not just your religion, but read as much as you can be exposed to.
Read as much as you can be exposed to. It's hard to tell a student to find the counter voices, but whenever you can, try to see if the religion has its own history or tradition of debates. You know, so for me, one of the reasons why I became more confident and empowered in my own Hindu identity later on, in my 30s, is because I began to realize that there were a lot of debates for centuries within this tradition that we're never really exposed to, or we never really learn about. So what were the debates about Christianity, or Judaism, or Zoroastrianism at these various junctures? Because that also allows us to see how religion has evolved with society.
Right. Well, the topic of religion definitely has been going on for centuries, and it probably will definitely be going on for many more. But for the time that we've had you, Murali, thank you so much for your perspectives. This has been very, pardon the pun, enlightening.
Thank you.
On that note, that'll wrap up our show for today. If you like what you saw in today's episode, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on our social media platforms at the bottom of the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, and remember, every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.